Joining us now is Professor Vijay Prashad. He is the Edward Said Chair at American University in Beirut. Hi, Professor Prashad. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's a great pleasure to have you on. And I wanted to start off by speaking with you about, we've been covering the Bradley Manning trial extensively on this show. He hasn't been sentenced yet, but obviously he faces a very draconian punishment in addition to what he's already gone through. And I wanted to focus on an aspect of his disclosures, which I don't think always get enough attention, which is really the kind of systemic interference of U.S. foreign policy in developing countries, if I could put it like that. So, as an example, would be the U.S. Pressuring the Haitian government to not raise that country's minimum wage. And I'm just wondering if you could run down other revelations like that Bradley Manning released, and kind of put that in context for us.
Well, it's very interesting. There were, I don't know, 700,000 State Department cables released, and two contradictory views were put forward by the U.S. government on that release. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, they said this is very bad for U.S. Diplomacy. This is going to put people at great risk, etc. On the other hand, they said nothing in here is what is going to be a surprise to anybody. In other words, they heightened the fear-mongering around the release itself to put pressure on people like Manning, whistleblowers like Manning. And on the other hand, they say, well, there's nothing in here, so you needn't bother to read it. It's a very clever strategy of both amping up the fear-mongering around whistleblowing and to deflate expectations of what one might find in the release. Well, if you actually went and looked through the release, you would find a series of very important revelations. The most significant revelation for our present moment is, it showed how the United States government was colluding with governments around the world, including in Yemen and Pakistan, with the drone program. So you have Yemeni leaders saying to the American government, you go ahead and continue with the drone attacks just as long as you leave enough space for us to claim responsibility, because, our sovereignty is on the line, etc. So the drone program is very, I think that there's a lot that can be learned from how the drone program operated in WikiLeaks. The second set of revelations that got almost zero coverage was the one you have mentioned, which is the economic pressures. And let's just take the example you gave. You gave the example of Haiti. It's very interesting that in the Haitian releases, which I think the Nation magazine may have been the one to concentrate on those, in the Haitian release, these companies, such as, I think, mainly companies that manufacture undergarments.
Yeah, like Fruit of the Loom.
Fruit on the Loom or something. I can't remember exactly.
I think it was Fruit of the Loom, yeah.
Fruit of the Loom. And maybe the other one, the women's undergarments. It's with an H. I can't remember the name.
I can't help you on that one.
At any rate.
No.
Yeah, at any rate, these firms had approached the U.S. Embassy in Port-au-Prince, and the U.S. ambassador and his team reached out to René Préval, the head of government, and asked him to use his authority to put pressure to minimum, to tamp down wages, to something, some abysmal level of wages to begin with. So the second set of revelations, if the first set was about political matters and really, quite scandalous collusion with foreign governments, the second was the use of the U.S. diplomatic corps for corporate ends. Now, it should be said that somebody can turn around and say, well, why else do you have a diplomatic corps? I mean, right. Diplomatic corps around the world use their influence as best as they can, to get a good deal for their firms. There's a big difference between trying to get a good deal for your firm and involving yourself in domestic labor management and economic policy. In other words, the question of minimum wage for a sovereign country like Haiti. So I think there was almost zero coverage of what had happened, and if there was coverage, it misconstrued the coverage. So the coverage wasn't the U.S. government intervened. Well, all governments intervene, all diplomatic corps intervene. The question is here, it wasn't to get, fruit on the loom, to get them a meeting with somebody in the Haitian, labor ministry. It was to actually use the offices of the U.S. government to pressure the Haitian government on how they should handle their minimum wage, regime.
Exactly.
I think that's a very disturbing, issue.
No, and I think that that's really crucial, and I really appreciate how you highlighted that, because I think that a lot of us, even among the kind of broader general public, there is some familiarity with trade regimes and how trade regimes have been written. I think even at a very basic level, there's a sense that trade agreements, they're not strictly speaking just these neutral regimes of trade and tariffs. They've been written to benefit certain sectors of the U.S. economy. They've been written to benefit, primarily corporate special interests. That's pretty obvious and pretty clear. But even that process, even if you object to it, that's a bureaucratic process. That's well, look, we signed these agreements. Maybe we don't like how these agreements are made. There's problems with lobbying and all the rest. And that's valid to critique and object to. But it almost shields this more kind of like ruthless arm that is still exercised in the Haiti example. And I think that that's interesting. How widespread in U.S. foreign policy and in developed world foreign policy is that kind of iron fist behind the bureaucracy of the trade agreements? I guess what I'm saying is you might hear somebody say, hey, that's not good for Haiti's development strategy, and if they raise their wages, they might not meet their obligations under some bilateral trade agreement or some World Bank loan, and that's a problem. But this is the next step, like you're saying. This is literally the direct application of U.S. foreign policy as a tool of a very narrow economic interest.
Yes, I mean, this is not even, one can make the case, and I think it's a legitimate case to make, where a country goes to another country and says, we think that your, these tariffs that you have, or these subsidies that you provide is not making it possible for our business, in general, to work with you effectively. In other words, there's a broad swath discussion about trade policy where the United States says if you get rid of these subsidies, then all our businesses can come and do business in a much more, in a much more robust way.
Right.
But when you have the U.S. government essentially lobbying for one or two corporations, and really, it's almost as if the ambassador is the lobbyist for fruit on the loom.
Right.
Fruit on the loom. There's something crass about that in the first instance. There are a private entity, which I'm not even clear what its holdings are. It may be owned by a Swiss company at the end of the chain.
Right.
A private entity has the ambassador of the United States lobbying for them. There's something, I think, very disturbing about that. And I think there should be a broader discussion whether the United States population would like to see its representatives work as emissaries of specific private corporations, rather than, for the good of the, U.S. business in general, which I think is the legitimate thing, where you can talk about improving the climate for trade in general.
Right.
So this distinction, I think, is quite an important distinction, because private companies should not assume that they have a special and privileged access, not only to their congressmen. That is already a fight that's lost, I think, where U.S. Congress people, elected representatives, have become essentially emissaries of particular corporate. But now your diplomatic corps is also being reduced to that.
Right.
I think this is disturbing for domestic purposes. In other words, for U.S. citizens should be disturbed by this. This is very disturbing around the world, where one of the, let's just say it's a false sense of well-being, but one of the great ways in which many countries around the world hold their head up high is they say, well, our diplomatic corps is professional and is not touched by any of these kind of commercial things or whatever. They're a highly professional group of people. In fact, I just heard an interview with the current Egyptian foreign minister, Nabil Fahmy, where Fahmy was asked, you used to be in the Egyptian diplomatic service during the Mubarak era, so aren't you compromised? And he said, let me tell you something. When you join the diplomatic service in Egypt, you don't serve anybody. You just work professionally. And he says, we are a very professional corps of people.
Right.
That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. When you have now tasked your ambassadors to operate on behalf of specific commercial interests, there's a real loss of face for them in front of the diplomatic corps around the world.
No, and I think that that's just such a vital, the economic parallel of the disclosures on things like drones or the collateral murder video. It's really important to highlight. So I want to get into, you have a new book out called The Poorer Nations, which came out, I believe, it was in February of this year. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So, and what you're doing is you're kind of doing a political history of the developing world, the third world, and you're kind of plotting where it's going and what its political project is. And I'm interested if you could kind of explain that. And I think you've said that it's kind of congealing with the BRIC countries, and maybe you could explain what the BRIC countries are and this strategy of growth with equity, I think you've called it, and why that might be an interesting answer to kind of Western-led neoliberalism, but not quite a credible alternative.
Right. So, just to shorten this very, very dramatically, from the 1990s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the collapse of really any effective countervailing force, the United States and its North Atlantic allies, mainly Western Europe, but we should also add Japan on the other end, began a real thrust on two different axes. One was political, where the assumption was that now the United States and its allies would determine the political future of the planet. Whether you use the UN Security Council or not, you can bomb in Yugoslavia and create, the Dayton Accords. You can come in and bomb in Iraq, etc. So there was a sense that the planet was there to be organized politically through the wishes of the United States and its European allies. Then the second was on the economic front. The assumption was that all other kinds of economic systems or challenges had been invalidated. And what was left standing was a sort of liberal capitalism, liberal democracy with free market capitalism.
The end of history.
That was the future. Yeah. Sorry?
No, I just said the end of history, that sort of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was Fukuyama's book, The End of History, was the sort of intellectual, orientation of this triumphant emergence of Americanism, not just the United States, but sort of Americanism. And in this, what it meant was the U.S. and its European allies attempted to push forward a certain trade regime, which they very successfully pushed forward during the Clinton years.
Yep.
It included, rather than multilateral trading agreements, although there were those through the WTO, it included an increase in bilateral trading. And, one so-called bilateral or trilateral was NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement of 1994. So what things like NAFTA and, other bilateral deals, free trade agreements, etc., what they did was they essentially allowed the advantages of history to benefit, those who had been its beneficiaries, as it were. to continue to benefit them. So for instance, I'll just give you one example. There was a new intellectual property law that went into place. And in previous eras, intellectual property was based on the process that you use to get to a product. If you use a different process, you're welcome to make the same product. Mm-hmm. In the 1990s, the new law was that the product was patented. What this meant was that in the United States, firms that had come up with new developments need no longer worry about producing them inside the country. You can outsource it anywhere in the world. But because of the new intellectual property regime, you're guaranteed a rent of that good that you're producing. This meant that in the United States, you started losing industrial jobs. It meant that there were low-wage jobs going to other countries, but it meant that American firms could continue to post very large profits. And that was the crucial process by which you get this triumphalism. At the same time, you get deindustrialization in America, and you get the rise of petty industry around the world. And, this was assumed that it will happen forever. But of course, it doesn't happen forever, because where you start outsourcing your jobs to, those countries begin to emerge as powerhouses. And the BRICS emerge, one, concretely through the fact that there are now industries in some of these countries, like in China, for instance, which booms.
Just to be clear for the audience, the BRICS are Brazil, China, Russia, and India, and I think South Africa might be informally part of that group now as well?
Yes, formally, in fact, from 2009, Brazil, Russia, China, India, South Africa.
Okay.
These are countries that benefited greatly. At the same time, they felt hemmed in by the kind of political and economic Americanism of the 1990s. And it's that challenge that they have now, to basically counter this suffocation, what they feel is a political suffocation. They created the BRICS project, and their emergence, I think, has brought us to some extent back toward the road of multilateralism, where you don't have one country and its allies determining the fate of the planet.
But you also have some criticisms of the BRIC approach, because you think that I don't want to sort of I'm trying to summarize what I think you've said, that it's still limited and kind of hemmed in by a certain market vision that won't kind of, in the end of the day, address core structural inequities in BRIC countries, or if it's exported even as a model. So then there's this third examples you're looking to, which are like the more radical governments in Bolivia, Venezuela, and then also this growth of social movements, which is interesting because you draw the parallel with the deindustrialization of the West. It seemed like through the 90s, as we were deindustrializing, we were kind of floating on this tech bubble economy, and housing prices were going up and everything seemed fine. But of course, it's really not. The middle class and the working class are very hollowed out in the United States. So there's this kind of, is there a third parallel, a third track you're identifying of movements and kind of radical experiments in governance as well?
Oh, of course. I mean, the problem with the BRICS is that they, even though they are a challenge to the unipolar or single, dominance by the U.S. and its allies, they follow the same kind of growth trajectory. The idea is that to live in the world, the core, thing that we must all follow is our growth rate must keep going up. And despite the fact that there may be inequalities, despite the fact that there may be unemployment, etc. In other words, growth becomes the single-minded focus of political governance. This is a very disturbing trend, but it's what we have in these countries. Now, in Latin America, for a host of different reasons, a different kind of growth trajectory has been experimented with, where horizontal development, trying to fight against inequalities and trying to increase consumption rates of ordinary people is the premise of their growth. And I think this is very promising for us. It should be very promising for people in the United States. This idea has been developed that Latin America is ruled by dictators, that, it's authoritarian, etc. This is a smokescreen. It prevents people in the United States from looking closely to the closest geographical region where something different and interesting is happening. In the United States, the only way to continue to maintain levels of prosperity is to keep inflating asset bubbles.
Yes.
Whether it's going to be housing again, it may be, credit card debt, and these bubbles will be inflated by Chinese, Gulf Arab, other big sovereign funds with their credit. It's a very unhealthy situation. And recently I heard President Obama say, the second job of the Fed, you have one job is to create monetary policy, to create some confidence in money. But the second job, he said, it's remarkable that he said this, is for full employment. He said full employment is important.
Right.
You're never going to get full employment in the United States if the government continues to pursue a growth-led development model. There has to be a different way, and that is being modeled in Latin America.
And do you think, and connected to that, do you have optimism in the kind of constellation of social movements, like obviously we saw Occupy in America, but all across, and certainly Europe, in response to the kind of self-detonation through austerity, you do see these social movements, and then I think it's an interesting parallel because in a global sense, I'm seeing you're drawing a distinction between some of the experiments and hope in Latin America and the improvement that the BRICS offer, but the fact that they don't fully offer a way out. And I think that there's a parallel between that and the kind of exhaustion maybe of social democratic models in Europe and even in the or democratic models in the United States, and the growth of these social movements generally.
No, you're right, but I'll just be a little much more crude than that, in a sense. I mean, one of the grave problems in the United States is the undertow of the two-party system. Mm-hmm. So at two ends of the spectrum, you have populist breakthroughs. On the one side, you get a combination of people with not much wealth, but who had white-collar jobs, and then some blue-collar, upper-level blue-collar people entered the so-called Tea Party movement. In the early period, it's certainly a grassroots kind of effort. People who had been laid off from office parks, etc., who had their homes underwater, deep frustration, what's going on. Of course, that is going to get oversaturated with, racism, other things will come in, but basically that was a protest movement which very quickly is going to be grabbed by the Republican Party. That's what I mean by the undertow of the two-party system. On the other hand, you have Occupy. Again, here, what is the class background? A lot of students of different classes struggling under student debt. Mm-hmm. A lot of people who had been laid off from the promise of some kind of life. A lot of people frustrated, people who found themselves in trade unions and them being betrayed by the political parties. A lot of activity. But once again, the pressure on the Occupy movement from the Democratic Party this side, saying, well, it's an election coming up and you have to fight against the right. Unless this undertow of the two-party system is somehow set aside, and genuine mass political movements are able to emerge that actually threaten the political order, which put them on notice genuinely, there's going to be no possibility in the United States of changing the course of its social democracy or its, or its political economy. There will be no hope of reviving, 19th century social democracy, any kind of politics, unless this is gone. I mean, the tragedy is that the two mainstream parties share so very much in the way they manage the politics and the economy, but that small bandwidth of difference that they exaggerate, around social issues allows them to capture the entirety of the political space. And I think unless that ends, there's very little hope for a new direction in the United States.
Well, thank you so much. On that note, Vijay Prashad, we're gonna end. I really, really appreciate your time. I recommend highly everybody look up Vijay Prashad's new book, The Poorer Nations, as well as his other work. There's also The Darker Nations, several other really, really important pieces, and you can see his writing a counterpunch among other outlets. Thank you so much, Vijay Prashad.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.